I have no doubt whatsoever that the real motivation behind both Wounded Knee 2 and the Oglala firefight and much of the turmoil throughout Indian country since the early 1970s was and is the mining company's desire to muffle AIM and all traditional Indian people who sought and still seek to protect the land, water, and air from their thefts and depredations. In this sad and tragic age we live in, to come to the defense of Mother Earth is to be branded a criminal. Leonard Peltier from Prison Writings.
Leonard Peltier is an American Indian movement political prisoner who's been in prison since 1976. He's in prison primarily for three reasons that we need to be concerned with. First is Leonard himself. Leonard has been a strong activist throughout the years, long before he went to prison and throughout his prison years. And he has stood for the people, and we need to stand for him. Second, Leonard's case shows how far the government will go to frame an activist that they want to get out of the way. And the third reason has to do with the U.S. government and corporation policies on native land throughout the history of this country. Before Leonard Peltier and AIM came about and started to put a spotlight on native land, most of the U.S. government policies on native land were rather invisible to most people. People didn't know about the breaking of the treaties. They did not know about the termination programs, of forced sterilization programs, and other such things which were used to get native people out of the way. The reason why they wanted to get native people out of the way is back in the time that they signed the treaties with native people, they placed native people on land that they thought that was unwanted by farmers, ranchers, and water rights. Later on, particularly going into the 20th century, minerals were discovered on these lands that industrial America needed, things like gold, oil, natural gas, uranium, and so on. In order to get all these minerals, the policy was to continue the theft of native land. They would cheat native people in any way that they could. The U.S. government was officially the guardians of native land. They were under a guardianship because the U.S. government said, well, we can handle your affairs better than you could. But the reality is that they allowed corporations, energy corporations, onto these lands that paid little or no royalties, and what royalties they did pay were very small. Well, this process of stealing more and more native land continued into the 60s, but in the late 60s, kind of as an offshoot of everything else that was going on in the time, civil rights movement and whatnot, Native Americans began to organize. You had things like the occupation of Alcatraz, you had the fishing rights struggles, and you had the American Indian movement. What made the corporations and the government so fearful of AIM and these other groups and people was that they were putting a spotlight on the native situation in the United States. When AIM was requested by traditional Lakota elders to occupy Wounded Knee and the 73-day occupation of that place, that put such a huge international spotlight on native land and native existence that became very troubling to the U.S. government. So after that, the U.S. government attempted to do everything in its power to suppress AIM. They even went to further extremes than they did, trying to suppress groups like the Black Panthers and other such groups. They basically, almost every member of the American Indian movement during that period of time was in jail or was in hiding. They had frame-up trials. Most of the time they won their trials, but so much resources went into the trials that they could not do the work that they were doing previously. Between Wounded Knee and the firefight that Leonard was framed up for, there were over 66 murders of traditional people, AIM people, and AIM supporters on the Pine Ridge Reservation. Now one has to wonder, well, what is in Pine Ridge that is so important to the government and the corporations? What it was uranium. The U.S. government had done a secret satellite survey of the Pine Ridge Reservation, and they found high-grade uranium in the northwest corner in an area that the government called the Gunnery Range. They wanted this area and wanted this uranium, but they knew that they could not go to the traditional people to try to buy that land from them, because the traditional people had still refused any payment for the Black Hills that was stolen from them. So they went about trying to suppress the traditional elder people. So the traditional elder people requested assistance from the American Indian movement, and they came in. Nobody really realized the extent of what was going on at the time and what was behind the events that were coming about. But because of them, many members of AIM were in prison, and eventually they found that that was not enough. What they needed to do was to get AIM out of the picture at a very important, convenient time for them. Dickie Wilson, who was a corrupt tribal chairman who got elected on Pine Ridge in a fraudian tribal election, was going to go to Washington, D.C. to sign away illegally, wasn't authorized by the Tribal Council or anything, that section of the Pine Ridge Reservation to the U.S. government that was going to turn it over to TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, to regulate uranium mining there. So at the same time that Dickie Wilson was in Washington, D.C., the government decided that they had to do something to suppress AIM and the traditional elders. They wanted to make sure that it was not something like Wounded Knee again, an extended occupation that created another spotlight. They wanted something over quick and fast. So they staged a firefight. How we know that it was staged is, first, the two FBI agents that went into the area were SWAT team trained agents and counterintelligence agents. These two were among the top trained FBI agents in the Bureau. They were not just some, low-level flunkies. They went on to the Jumping Bull compound at that time looking for a young Indian boy by the name of Jimmy Eagle, a 16-year-old who was allegedly involved in the theft of a pair of used cowboy boots in a drunken fight a few days before. They used that as the excuse to send the FBI onto that compound. That was the first thing, because that's not even FBI jurisdiction on Pine Ridge. They only have jurisdiction over major felonies, and stealing used cowboy boots is not a major felony as far as anybody else knows. Second, they had roadblocks set up in all the roads leading into the area. Third, the local hospitals had been informed about expecting possible casualties later on in the day. So these two cars moved on to the Jumping Bull compound where Leonard and AIM had an encounter, and they had followed a red pickup truck, which it was said that Jimmy Eagle was seen in. Unfortunately for the FBI, and their story is, that red pickup truck was a very slow-moving reservation vehicle, and they could have pulled over that vehicle anytime they wanted out on the highway, and their story of trying to follow this alleged criminal just does not hold water. What they did is they pulled into the Jumping Bull compound, private property, which they had no warrant to be there. Their only justification was following this red pickup truck, pulled up into a defensive position, got out armed, and a firefight assured. Well, they needed somebody to blame for this. First they tried two AIM activists, and they were found not guilty for a reason of self-defense. Then they went after Leonard. And Leonard was eventually convicted under a different judge that refused to allow any self-defense of the murders. Later on, through the appeals process, we disproved the government's whole case against Leonard. So Leonard is basically in prison for all these years for aiding and abetting an act of self-defense. The real reason why Leonard is in prison is because these corporations do not want the American people to understand how they come about with their great wealth. Their great wealth came about in this country by the genocide and the theft of native land, and then the exploitation of workers, of slavery, and other such things. If people understood what happened to the native people in this land, then they would have complete understanding of what's happening in places like Iraq, where the government lied to the people about what they went in there for. They went in there for oil and for the corporations. This has been a continuous process, but the basis of it, the roots of it, all goes back to native land, and that's why they attempted to suppress AIM and Leonard Peltier, and why they do not want this story out. If we get this story out, then we will be doing something that they fear, and they might then decide that it's time to free Leonard before too many people learn of the truth behind his case. So it's important for every one of you, no matter who you are, no matter what struggle or oppression you may be facing, Leonard is connected to it. And you need to work for Leonard, not just for who he is, not just for why he's there, but for yourselves. Because this is the world that you live in and the world that you are helped creating. When I say these things, some people like to say that I'm un-American and that if I don't love America, I should get out. Well, I respond differently to those people and say I do love this land, and I do not want to see the people oppressed, exploited, and murdered by these greedy rich people for their political and economic purposes. I do love the land, and I do not want to see it abused and polluted for the enrichment of these people. And it is we, the people of this country that live here, that have struggled for so many years, like Leonard has, that make up the real America, the real land and country that we live in. And that is what I do love, and I'm proud to be among the people struggling for a better way of life here. Thank you very much.